You have to really look hard within yourself as an HR leader and determine not just what are your values, but how deeply do you hold them and how much do you want to fight for them? And by the way, you don't have to fight all the time. You don't have to fight every single second. It's okay to pick your moments, but you have to decide whether your values are things that really matter to you and you're going to, protect the people in your organization, you're going to fight for them or not. The second thing is you have to really ruthlessly diagnose where your company is and how much they're willing to tolerate if you work for a company.
Hey everyone, welcome to LinkedIn Presents Redefining Work podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Laszlo Bock. If you work in the space of HR people, talent, recruiting, HR tech, whatever it may be, I'm sure the name Laszlo Bock is familiar to you. He is known for creating a data-driven approach to HR through people operations at Google. He is a multiple-time founder of HR technology companies. He's created a new course at Berkeley to help CHROs level up their capabilities. And he's been a guiding force in this space for over a decade. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. Laszlo, I know I kind of laid out your bio already, but I will just turn it back over to you. What would you like the audience to know about you before we dig in?
Lars, first, thanks for having me on. You've had an amazing podcast over these last 12 seasons, and you always find compelling, super interesting people to be on. So honored to be on here with you. So thank you. I think the kind of stuff that's not on the bio is I came to the U.S. when I was 2 as a refugee from communist Romania and had no idea about corporate America. I didn't know HR was a function or anything like that. And so the path to getting where I sort of ended up went all over the place. So if anybody listening or watching doesn't exactly know what they want to be when they grow up, there's hope. Things tend to work out. So honored to be here.
Yeah. Well, I want to, I think most people who work in our space are familiar, at least at some level, with your work. Some people go very deep. And at the end of this, we're going to get to a few listener questions from people that have been following your work and referencing, things that you put out, many years ago that had a profound influence on their work. But I want to go back. You mentioned kind of coming over as a refugee at the age of 2. What was young Laszlo like? Walk me through your upbringing and how that maybe shaped and influenced your professional career and your life as you grow older.
So when I was a kid, so neither of my parents, I was very lucky. Both my parents spoke English. They both had advanced degrees. My dad is an engineer. My mom had been a teacher and then subsequently got an MBA. They both ended up starting their own businesses. I had a brother who started a business eventually as well. So one element was there was always this kind of notion to build things and create things and honestly, to take advantage of the opportunities that are available in the United States that weren't available, in the place I came from. I think the second thing was my dad started an engineering company a few years after we came to the US. And even as a kid, I saw that he treated his people really well. He had a partner who was a true partner. He was his number 2 guy, but he split ownership with the guy, took care of him. I eventually learned when I was in high school, he had a pension plan for his employees. He had up to, I think at peak, around 35 employees, but he had a pension plan that he didn't tell folks about until they were there for 5 years because he wanted them to stay because they cared about the work and the job, not because they were trying to get a payout. And so early on, I learned these lessons from my parents that it's important to treat people right. It's important to be fair to people. It's important to care for people, and that it's important to build. But growing up, kind of probably typical Southern Californian, upbringing, running around outside a lot, playing a lot of video games. And then really, didn't figure out my professional situation until, probably 3 or 4 years after I graduated college. So, but as a kid, probably pretty normal, some financial struggles as a family, which also informed a lot of things about me. And I had the benefit of parents setting a really good example.
Yeah. I mean, did that, being around such an entrepreneurial family, did you know early on, like obviously, you've went on to kind of co-found two companies and create other, kind of 0 to 1 efforts, including your new Berkeley course. Did that notion that you were going to build something, that you were going to, I mean, you started your career at McKinsey and GE, and then obviously, Google and leading large teams, but did you have it in the back of your mind, even then, that at some point, maybe you didn't know what it was, maybe you did, but at some point you were going to have to kind of test yourself as an entrepreneur and see what you could build?
I did not. I have no idea. Okay. And it's funny in retrospect, because we also, there were a lot of, probably like a lot of immigrants, or I know like a lot of immigrants. My family tried a lot of what we now call entrepreneurial things. I won't spend too much time on it, but we at one point in the 1970s, our family was, I think, the biggest importer of frozen egg rolls into Southern California. And big was not big at all. It was like tiny. And I remember riding around in our family station wagon, like going to a warehouse, loading up the back with frozen egg rolls, Colonel Lee's frozen egg rolls, with a partnership with a neighbor, and then driving it to Chinese restaurants in Southern California. So there was always like something my folks were trying. But no, I never felt a call to sort of start something. And the first kind of inkling of it actually was when I got to Google. Because before getting to Google, I'd had this idea that maybe with some science, maybe with some data, you could actually really do something different. And kind of creating people analytics at Google was the first thing I really built, I think, from scratch. Obviously, together with this guy, Prasad Sethi, who was my head of people analytics and was absolutely fantastic and coined the phrase people analytics. But no, and it wasn't until years later that I thought about actually starting a company.
Yeah. So my father immigrated from Germany as well, and also had an entrepreneurial flair. Like his father had a steamship business in Germany, and he came to the US and kind of started his own, and then started a range of companies over my childhood and young adult life. But also like you, I'd never had an ambition of being an entrepreneur, right? Until the moment that I did. And so it's interesting, I think, when you look back on that upbringing and maybe how that influence, whether directly or subtly, ultimately shapes where you end up going and kind of what you pursue. I want to spend some, please.
I know you're supposed to be interviewing me, but like, what was the moment that made you realize you wanted to build?
I think when I look back, my last corporate role was running talent innovation at NPR. And so I was brought in to kind of lead the digital transformation of NPR as they're moving from radio and broadcast to digital. And a friend of mine, Danielle Diebler, who worked on the kind of marketing and comms team, she had this idea. One of the things NPR was trying to do is to reach younger audiences. And so she created this initiative called Generation Listen. And in that, like, I ended up partnering with her in it. It was her thing. I was definitely the support person. But I was like, well, this is going to help us from a talent perspective, because obviously what you're doing is going to help us reach younger audiences. But they had created this advisory board in Generation Listen of these just phenomenal, like at that time, mostly 20-something founders, just brilliant people. And being exposed to them, seeing their enthusiasm to build, seeing their excitement, seeing the way they thought about challenges and problems through there was never like, no, like there was nothing that they couldn't do. It was always like, well, have we thought about this? And it was so invigorating to kind of be around that spirit. That's really kind of what nudged me. And then, the thing that ultimately pushed me was my boss was recruited over to SpaceX to run HR for them and wanted me to come over to run talent. But we had already lived in LA twice. And, at that point, starting a family, we weren't going to move back. But I was like, well, I could start my own firm and kind of take you on as a client and help you do all these things. And so they became my first client. It was an easier segue into, rolling into obviously a client like that. But yeah, that was the inspiration. It was something I never thought I wanted to do. Like the idea of being out on my own was just, it was just never something where I was like, ooh, I'm really drawn to do that. But I think that exposure just opened my mind up to the possibilities. And I was like, what can I build? Like if I really kind of put my mind to this, what might I do? So
Well,
Yeah.
I think there's something to your comment about being around other people who are kind of like building things, these young founders. I think I found the same thing moving out to take the Google job in 2006, and suddenly being in the middle of Silicon Valley and these legendary venture capital firms and startups, and I think there's when you're surrounded by folks like this, it feels much less risky and more accessible. And then the crazy thing I learned is that if you write a really good PowerPoint, somebody will give you millions of dollars to start a business. Right. And that de-risks it a lot too, and it lets you actually do more ambitious things. But I think there's something around, like you experienced, the being around people who are also building that kind of catalyzes entrepreneurialism.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to 2006. Yes. Obviously coming into Google, creating people operations, right, as a function, which, before that, to my knowledge, hadn't existed. And I'm sure you have hard data on this, so let's talk about that. But I think it was a turning point, I think, for the field of HR. And I think for many of us who are kind of students of the evolution of our field, that is something that I think is widely pointed to as a turning point in terms of how we operated, not just what we called ourselves, but like how we thought about aligning to the business, measuring our results, being much more data-driven. Walk me through those early moments. Like, I know I've read some of your interviews. You talked about how you landed on people operations and kind of connecting to the end. But I'd love to just hear that story, if you wouldn't mind. Like when you're in there and you're in the role, and they're like, "What are we going to call this?" Like, how did that all come together for you?
Yeah, well, so I'd received the job offer. And the whole process, I'd been interviewing it, and the title was human resources. And I was super excited because, excited about the company, the move. It's funny. So I was a GE at the time, and Google was still viewed as a very risky move, and certainly from people from GE. So my CEO of my division was like, "We'll hold a job for you. You can always come back," which was a lovely, lovely thought. And then Google turned out to be this rocket ship. But when I actually got the final offer letter, it said people operations. And my first reaction was, well, crap, because I wanted this head of HR job. It was like, for all the obvious reasons. But I also figured, well, if it doesn't work out, I can go get another head of HR job. But if the title isn't head of HR, then how am I going to explain to people that this is actually head of HR? So I called up Google and I said, I noticed the title's different. Can we call it human resources? And the person I was talking to said, well, we can change it if you want after 6 months. But the reason we changed it to people operations was if we put the word operations in it, the engineers will think it's more technical. And I was like, oh, okay. As long as we can change it, fine.
Yeah.
And then I showed up, and in my first week, I met with this guy, Urs Holtzley. And Urs is one of the first 10 or 11 employees of Google. He's still there. He designed Google's data centers. He ran infrastructure, and he's a genuinely amazing human being. But he was a professor at UC Santa Barbara, incredibly smart guy, and an engineer's engineer, and super hyper rational. And in the first meeting, he sat down with me and he said, "Oh, people operations, what a great title." And I was like, I can't change it. I can't change it. They were right. The engineers think it's a great title. I got to go with it. And then I eventually, because we did a number of things kind of differently in terms of how we use data and some of the values we had behind the function, when people would ask, what is people operations? I started describing it as scientific rigor combined with Google-paced innovation. And the whole idea eventually after the first year was that we need to be able to prove everything scientifically, but we need to do it quickly and as fast as the company is growing and do some real good for people along the way. And that's how I've always thought about it. That's about scientific quality at speed. And I know in a lot of companies that have used it. I remember talking to one company they were a startup at the time, and now it's a $30 billion valuation or something. And they had a head of engineering running people ops. And he said, I asked, that's awesome that you call it people ops. What does it mean? He says, oh, nothing. It's just HR. We just call it something. And my heart kind of broke.
Yeah.
So the idea was science and innovation.
Yeah. Well, the analogy you just gave, the example, I mean, so much of kind of the nomenclature around our field is, is it optics? Or is it actually how we think about the work that we do and the impact that we bring to the business? And so now it's, I think HR expanded to people and operations. Now we have talent and culture. We have human capital, but please don't use that. Please don't use human capital, but it exists. But I think, there's kind of this debate, right? We're like, well, we are human resources. And then there's other people like, well, there's so much legacy baggage around the term human resources that we really need a refresh, but it can't be in title only. It has to be in mindset and results, in the way that we're structured, the way that we're aligned to the business. Do you have a perspective on that kind of today? Obviously, we've got some miles between that decision in 2006 and where we sit today. What are your thoughts on kind of just the field, the naming conventions, and just kind of the state of HR? I'll go meta on you with state of HR, but like zoom out for a moment.
Well, first of all, I think words matter.
Yeah.
And I think if you call something people operations, it should mean something different than, like human resources or personnel or what have you. So a great example, I'll come to the meta point in just a sec, but is people analytics. So when I started at Google, within months, I really wanted to do something powerful with analytics. And there were 3 people on the team. There was a guy on the compensation team named Sharat Bulusu, who had, I think, a master's in organizational science or a similar field. Maybe it was a master's in engineering. There was a guy named Mike West who was on the benefits team who had who I think also had a master's. And there was a guy named Todd Carlisle who had a PhD in IO psychology on the staffing team. And I said, okay, I want you 3 to step out of your 3 teams and now be a single team. And we're going to do really cool science and math and solve big problems. And that became the core of what eventually became people analytics. And then a year later, we hired Prasad Sethi, who I mentioned before. And I said, okay. And I had some terrible name for the team. I can't remember what it was. I blocked it out. And I said, Prasad, I want you to come in and run whatever I was calling it. And he said, that's a terrible name. Can we call it people analytics? I was like, yeah, that's really good. And that's when people analytics, like the words came together as like a field.
Yeah.
And then Prasad led a lot of this, and we built something pretty amazing. And what's been interesting, and this comes back to the meta point, is now lots of companies have people analytics teams, but for most of them, the work is what would have been called workforce analytics, 10 or 20 years ago, right? It's headcount forecasting, it's attrition tracking. There's very few companies where they're actually doing experiments, where they're actually testing to see, should we have 3 or 5 or 10 performance review buckets, or how many interviews do we need? So I think from a meta perspective, there's huge opportunity in the field. I think you still have a lot of people in the field for all the right reasons. They care about people. They want to do something good. They want to take care of people in their companies. And I still think we don't have enough analytic rigor and experimentation mindset. And I also think in the field, there's an opportunity for more courage.
Yeah.
Kind of speaking out about your values, for standing up for what you believe is right. And sometimes that's public, and sometimes it's private and stuff you can just roll out inside your companies without telling anybody, but that still does a lot of good.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's that last point, certainly going into a new year in 2025, a new administration in the US, lots of change that we're going to be experiencing, and lots of challenges, let's be real, that we're going to be navigating. And I think that those challenges are going to hit not just society, but our businesses. And we are, again, we as a field are going to find ourselves on the front line of that, much like we have time and time again since the pandemic, really. So this is going to be another component. And I'd love to get your perspective, right? So for HR leaders, we talk about burnout in the field, and burnout isn't unique to HR. I think all over 55% of managers, according to recent studies, are claiming they're at some level of burnout. So it's not unique to HR by any means. So I'll start with that. But it is, pretty acute in our field because of all of these external things that we've had to navigate and we've had to lead our companies and our employees through. How do you think about that, right? Especially kind of going into, and again, this will be a US specific comment, but there's a lot of volatility all around the world. Like getting into an environment where, unfortunately, it seems like volatility is more of the new norm than an exception. How can HR leaders think about how they show up with courage, how they show up and help the organization stick to their values, lead with their values, particularly when there may be some real headwinds against that?
It's a fantastic question. I think there's a few steps to it. One is you have to really look hard within yourself as an HR leader and determine not just what are your values, but how deeply do you hold them and how much do you want to fight for them? And by the way, you don't have to fight all the time. You don't have to fight every single second. It's okay to pick your moments, but you have to decide whether your values are things that really matter to you and you're going to, protect the people in your organization, you're going to fight for them or not. The second thing is you have to really ruthlessly diagnose where your company is and how much they're willing to tolerate if you work for a company. There's a framework that I've seen a number of companies start using, which is it's basically a 2x2 of what's important to our business and what's important to our employees. And important to our business includes our customers and so on. So it's a big category. And then they map political issues like Roe v. Wade or diversity on this thing. And they say, is it important to our business and is it important to our employees? And they're deciding to only weigh in on issues that are both of those things, right? And weigh in publicly. So companies are not just like pulling back on all the kinds of things they're saying, but they're being, almost ruthless in saying like, we're not going to engage in all these issues. So the second step is you as an HR leader need to be very clear-eyed about where your company is. And then the third is to map those two things together and decide like, okay, if this stuff's really important to me, is this a place I can speak out and be vocal about it? And if not, then you find a place where your values are more closely aligned. So, maybe you take a detour and spend a couple of years in a nonprofit organization or a more values-driven corporation or some other environment or academia. So I think in general, people need to kind of make that examination of what that match is. But I think more specifically in regards to courage, I think it's really vital, I think to do the HR job well, you need to be willing to walk away from it. And the way you do that without it getting fired is whoever your boss is, whether it's the CEO or whether it's, you're deeper in the organization, you go to your boss as soon as you're in the job and you say, look, I can do this job one of two ways. I can make everyone happy and avoid conflict, and I'm going to approve all kinds of things and say yes to all kinds of things, and I'm going to look the other way on all kinds of things. And when you do my review in 2 years and 3 years and 5 years, everyone's going to say, Laszlo's doing a great job. Things are easy, things are working, things are fine. Or I can really drive some change. And, we're in a hierarchical organization, so you tell your boss, I can really drive the kind of things you want to drive. But that means that over the next 3 or 5 years, I'm going to say no to everybody on this team on some issue. And so when you come and ask for feedback 3 to 5 years from now, everyone's going to say, Laszlo's great, except for this one thing, or he was hard to work with. And I'm happy to do the job either way. But you tell me what better serves you. And every good leader is going to say, well, obviously, do the right thing, support the values, the agenda. And then you've kind of pre-wired and given yourself some protection. Yeah. When you go out on a limb and fight for that hire or, fight for a program that you think is going to make a really big difference for folks.
That's really good advice. And I appreciate that perspective because I think, again, it's setting the foundation for the relationship and the decisions that will have to be made. And I think the 2x2 example is also very interesting because I think, we probably got to a point in business where, whether it was an issue was happening and it was aligned or not with the company's, mission, vision, et cetera. But, in almost all the scenarios, you'll have employees who will be impacted and it will matter to them. And having a level, I think the companies that really struggled are the ones that didn't really have a consistent view or philosophy as to how they handled these things. And so they would speak out on one thing and not speak out on another thing, and then not really have any, framework for how they responded. And that really put the CPOs and CHROs in a hard spot, because now people are looking to them like, well, wait a minute, I thought we don't talk about these things, or I thought we do talk about these things. So I think having that framework, I think, is really key. I want to come back to Google for a minute, because I think, we've talked about the kind of the origin of people operations as being a bit of a turning point for the field of HR. And I think over, your time there were many aspects that companies kind of pointed to Google around, Googliness, 20% time, brain teaser interviews, double-digit interview, structures. And, some of those things I think are things that serve the company really well. And some of those things in hindsight, probably didn't. And I'd love to do a little bit of myth busting with you, for a moment, right? Like, I think so many of those things are kind of looked at as like, lore of like, well, Google does this, Google does that. And like, as the architect of the things that Google did, are there things maybe that people gave you credit for that actually, or maybe held to be true, that as somebody kind of leading that from the inside was not, that you want to kind of, pop that balloon a little bit?
Yeah, I think the biggest, well, first, there were a whole bunch of things that together with the team. So Sunil Chandra, who led staffing and operations, and Judy Gilbert, who led staffing, and this guy Arnon Gashuri, who was there very early on. There were a lot of things we fixed and changed over time. So we went from an average of, I think the average candidate, and by the way, candidate means whether they got an offer or not, had something like 14 to 20 interviews, right, before a decision was made. That got reduced to 4 interviews. When I started, the company was indeed big on brain teasers, and we got rid of those because it was demonstrated that not only actually do they not predict performance, but the kinds of people, there's academic research on this that shows that the kinds of people who prefer giving brain teaser questions tend to be slightly more narcissistic and sociopathic than average people in society. So they just make the interviewer feel smart, right? There was a practice of focusing on where people went to college.
Yeah.
And when I joined, actually, we used to ask everyone for their SAT score and their college GPA, regardless of how old they were. So we hired Vint Cerf, one of the guys who invented the internet, literally one of the academics involved in building the early internet. And he was in his 50s when we hired him, and he was required to go back and find his test scores, right? Which was just madness. So we got rid of a bunch of things like that. But I think the two biggest myths were that we were able to do all these things for people because we had money. And Google was very profitable. But the things that had the greatest impact didn't really cost much. So things like having TGIF, so every Friday at all hands, where anyone could ask the executives questions and the founders questions. That sends a powerful message about culture and lack of hierarchy and transparency and openness and honesty. Cost nothing. Yeah. So most of the things we did that actually had the biggest impact didn't cost money. And then the second was, I think, some people look back at Google and say, well, there's no way that the culture could have kept scaling forever. And when I left, we had around 75,000 people. I think the company now has over 200,000. I'm not sure. But I actually don't think size is your constraining factor when it comes to keeping a great culture. I think your constraining factor when it comes to keeping a great culture is having leaders who have, to the point you were making about companies and values, a clear set of values, an ability to articulate them, and the courage to do so. Yeah. And that allows you to keep a culture scaling forever. And when you lose that, then you become an average company. Yeah.
Well, I love that you anchored it back to values, because I think, culture ultimately, even if it scales, it's still not static, right? Like it's still evolves, it still changes a bit. You enter new markets, you create new lines of business, you bring in different talent with different skill sets. That's all going to be, kind of an evolution catalyst for the culture. The values, if they're anchored correctly and if they're reinforced and lived and like true to the organization, then as you say, like that can scale infinitely because everybody kind of knows what the North Star is, even if there's like some subtle nuances to the culture. And even within an organization like Google or even a much smaller organization, like the culture you have at, if you have a headquarters, it can be a little different than a culture you have in another region or another country. And so you kind of have this like umbrella culture, but then also, kind of slightly variation versions of it in different areas. But again, if it's anchored to your values, regardless of where you sit, it's going to feel like the same company. Yeah.
Yeah. We always used to say that the Google culture was stronger than the local cultures. So like your point, the Japanese office felt different than the Barcelona office, but more than anything, it felt like you were at Google. Right? Yeah. When you can do that, it's a pretty special experience.
Yeah. I want to get tactical for a moment on the recruiting side, because then obviously, you were at Google for a large period of growth. What's your favorite interview question?
My favorite's super boring. Every time I interview, I ask people, give me an example of an analytically difficult problem that you have solved. And it's a super dull question, but it turns out general cognitive ability predicts almost 40% of job performance, as you know. And, the best way to test that is to ask people for examples of difficult things they've had to solve and then dig into it.
Yeah. So. Cool. I like that. It's always interesting to get everybody's go-to question. Okay. So Google, you reached the end of your time at Google, as we talked about. From there, you went to co-found Humu. You obviously, in the scope of the role that you had at Google, yes, you were overseeing all of people operations, but that was very much a business function. And I imagine there's a lot of experience and skills that you gained over that time at Google that, naturally transitioned and served you as a co-founder and CEO. But there's probably some gaps too, especially as a first-time founder. What were those gaps for you? Like when you made that transition, what were they? Was there anything surprising? Was there anything that you had to kind of consciously and deliberately build because you knew that was kind of a hole in your tool belt, if you will?
Yeah, there were a lot of gaps, but two big ones come to mind. One was I didn't anticipate the weight of responsibility I would feel founding or co-founding a company. And how all-consuming that responsibility is. I mean, I'd like go to sleep thinking about not just how to build a company, but specifically like how to close a deal so we get some revenue so we could raise our next round of financing. Because what's wild is you do a startup, you make up something. You make up something, you tell a good story, someone gives you a bunch of money to start building it, and then people join you because they believe in this vision, right? But the vision's not real. You haven't built it.
Yeah.
And it requires you to be much more strict and deliberate about how you build that company. So for example, at Google, there were a lot of things we did to manage performance and manage people out, and a lot of really cool kind of behind the scenes things. But at Humu, I had to exit somebody after 11 days. Like we hired somebody, it was a hiring mistake. By the way, there's a mistake embedded in the mistake. So the thing I didn't know was like the responsibility I would feel. And part of that was somebody who I'd worked with before, who I recruited in, on his third Monday, I sat down with him and was like, how do you think it's going? And had to exit the guy. But the reason we were in that situation was because we said, well, we're small, we're new, we all understand how this works. We don't have to do everything like Google did. So we just kind of hired people we knew and did normal interviews. And after that, we were like, no, we got to go back to the way we were interviewing. So one was I had to become more of a hard ass. I had to become more directive. And the second was selling and learning how to sell and, manage a sales organization. I remember when I was at Google, and your viewers and listeners will appreciate who are in HR, one of the things that's hard about the job is everyone inside sees your work. So anything goes wrong, they let you know, right? Like a check is late or like some performance rating is off or somebody's unhappy with their manager, it's your problem. And I remember wishing it'd be so great to be in sales where nobody inside the company can see my work. And all I have to do is hit these numbers. And how hard can it be? It turns out it's friggin' hard.
Yeah.
Because what I discovered is when you're a startup selling to large enterprise, which is what we were doing, everybody's really interested in what you're doing. And so they'll have tons and tons of meetings, but getting them to write a check is a whole different story and takes a long time. And so that was the other big skill set I did not have, was how to sell and how to help lead a sales organization.
Yeah. I mean, because you're, in a role like that, you're selling to HR primarily, right? So there's perhaps advantages and disadvantages of that. Like obviously coming from the role that you came from at Google, high profile role, very visible, you're probably not initiating conversations with people who didn't know who you were on some level. But the concept of what you were selling was perhaps different than the type of technology that they had been accustomed to using. So you have, it's almost like you have this instant sales credibility to kind of get you in the door, but now you really have to help them understand how is this going to solve your problems. And you have the unique perspective of like understanding the mindset of the buyer, because obviously you were in those shoes, but it's not the same as kind of, actually now having to sell to them and influence them and close the deal. Like getting the conversations probably, I imagine, was pretty easy. Closing the deal, not so much.
You're absolutely right. And I know, you've built your own business, so you've lived this. But, the front of the funnel was easy. We could get meetings with, not just almost any head of HR, but with almost any CEO. We had an early board deck where I'd gone to Bentonville and met with Doug McMillan, the CEO of Walmart, and he was very excited about what we were doing. And he was like, yeah, let's absolutely do something. And so I remember, board deck, we're flipping through the slides, and the last page was, oh, by the way, we signed Walmart. And, the board celebrated, everyone thought this was amazing. And I thought when the CEO says, let's deploy this, that the deal was done. I literally had no idea that you need a statement of work, you need to go through procurement, you need to go through, I knew kind of they need to write a check eventually, but I didn't know there's like a statement of work and there's a whole bunch of documents that have to be in order and here's all the concrete steps. And Walmart ended up never becoming a customer. So yeah, it was helpful, but it also hurt because normally, the people who will meet you first are slightly more likely to buy, but we could meet with anybody. And it was, as you said, this was at Humu, and this idea of nudging people was so novel that there was a lot of education to be done. So a lot of lessons.
Yeah. Well, let's fast forward to today. I know you're working on, a portfolio of things, but I want to talk about one of them, which is your new course for CHROs at Berkeley. Where did the idea for this course, like when I saw it released, I was excited to see it because I think that, the level of education support resources, especially for CHROs, particularly at a time where we have a lot of people moving into those roles for the first time. And historically, we do a pretty terrible job of equipping our CHROs and CPOs to lead effectively. There's just lots of things that they haven't seen or experienced that, to learn on the job is a lot. Where did the idea behind the course come from? How did you kind of narrow on the curriculum where you could include almost like a limitless amount of, courses, information, focus? Like what is the focus that really matters and how did the course come to be?
So the focus at Berkeley, and the program's called I think it's the Berkeley Transformational CHRO program, which I co-lead. The focus is that, and the thesis is that there's lots of good CHROs. There's some great ones, but there's very few that are transformational. And there's 4 things that are missing between what most CHROs today have and what the really transformational ones have. And when I say transformational, I think of people like Kathleen Hogan at Microsoft, Arden Hoffman at General Motors. And the 4 things are analytical skills, elite consulting style problem solving and structuring skills, some specific slices of knowledge, like some finance valuation, financial statement analysis kind of knowledge, and then cross-company networks and mentorship. So my thesis, and now our thesis, is that these are the things that are making the difference. And in our first cohort, we're enrolling for our second cohort right now, which will start in April of 25. But our first cohort is 41 people. 3 have already become CHROs, which is super exciting, and they're using it and applying it. But the genesis was, so, I'm sort of on my 3rd generation of CHROs that I've gotten to know, because I was at Google and got to know a bunch of CHROs, and then a bunch of them retired, and then started Humu and got to know a bunch of CHROs, and a bunch of them retired. And so selfishly, I wanted to stay connected to the HR community. I mean, these are great people doing really important work that don't get nearly enough love and attention. So that was one part of the genesis of it. It was a way for me personally to stay connected and give back to the HR community. The second thing was Heidrick & Struggles, the exec search firm, was doing a search for a client. And the client asked them to, they said, one of the things we view as an indicator of quality is how many people from an existing CHRO have gone on to become CHROs. And this person at Heidrick, Brad Warga, called me and he said, "You're not going to believe this, but you, Laszlo, have created more CHROs than anybody else ever." And I said, "I don't believe you." And so he sent me the spreadsheet. And there's over 150 people who've worked for me at Google who are now CHROs. Wow. And the next highest was 30 or something like that. So that gave me the confidence to say, well, maybe there's something in the approach we took, and thinking about analytics and these problem-solving skills and all this knowledge. And so I looked at what was out in the world, and there's a lot of HR development courses, which are kind of survey courses. You get a little benefits, a little performance management, a little org design, but there was nothing that had this perspective on here is what you need to be transformative. And so I approached Berkeley, and the faculty there, Jenny Chapman, Samir Shrivastava, the guy running Berkeley Exec Ed, Mike Riley, were all fantastically supportive and creative and thoughtful. And so now we built this 6-month program that's hybrid. And we actually have faculty not just from Berkeley, but we have Nick Bloom from Stanford teaching. We have Heidrick & Struggles and McKinsey teaching. We have practitioners teaching, our advisory board. So it's been super exciting. But the genesis originally was the world could use more really exceptional heads of HR. And, I'm hoping I can help make more of them along with the Berkeley folks.
I mean, that the data you shared from Brad is pretty wild. Like that's A, very cool for them to actually compile that. But B, I imagine that had to be just a moment of pride in your career when you thought about the impact that you've had. And I will send that shine your way. You don't have to kind of, you don't have to, tip your hat on that. But I think, when you look at great leaders in this space, they tend to have a common denominator that is probably pretty obvious, but they've worked with great leaders. They've worked with fundamentally sound, just really kind of leaders who can balance the needs of both the employees and the business, which isn't always easy, and do things the right way. And they have that imprint on them. And it's almost like, you kind of use the analogy of a company like the, PayPal and like the PayPal Mafia, how they've all gone on to do great things. I think the same can be, kind of drawn back to our field. And you see people who've worked for amazing leaders and what they've done. Not that I can distill, 150 CHROs into one, soundbite, but if you had to give advice, right, to an emerging chief people officer, an emerging head of people. So maybe they're actually not even somebody at the level yet where they're taking your Berkeley course, but that's the trajectory that they're on and where they see themselves. What advice would you have for them?
Well, here's why HR is the hardest job in the C-suite. Unlike all the other functions, there's not this established body of knowledge that you can just refer to and everyone goes like, oh, okay, fine. Like if you're the general counsel and you go, well, that's illegal. Everyone goes like, well, you're the lawyer. And if you're the CFO and you say, well, we can't do that because the SEC, they go, okay, well, you're the CFO, governance, controllership. If you're the sales leader, you say, well, here's what our customers want. Nobody inside spends as much time with customers as you do. HR's the hardest because it has the least kind of structural and positional power and the least sort of recognized expertise power. There's tremendous expertise in the field, but it's not like law or finance where, there's certifications and credentials and things like that you must have to get these jobs, right? There are certifications, but they're not mandatory. And so the advice I would have to people in the field is the way you amass power, and power is important because it lets you do good. So the way you amass power and influence in these jobs is you have to have data and science on your side. And data and science is just another word for the truth. And the classic example is every manager says, oh, I know what good looks like. I know how to hire. I know how to manage performance. I know how to pay people because I've been doing it. And a scientist would say, well, that is something called the fundamental attribution error. Every human being has this bias called the fundamental attribution error, which means if something good happens, it's because I'm a genius. And if something bad happens, it's everyone else's fault. And I, as a manager, have done stuff, and therefore I'm a good manager because it's worked for me. And the reality is they're probably wrong on most things. And, with science at Google and later at Humu, we demonstrated that, for example, 4 interviews are the ideal amount of interviews for a candidate. Not 5, not 3, not 20, 4. We demonstrated that the ideal amount of work from home is 1.5 days to 2 days per week. That maximizes happiness and productivity. And you can experimentally prove that. So that's the biggest advice. Think about what analyses you can do, what experiments you can do that then give you the authority to lead from the heart and be courageous and do the right things for your people.
Yeah. Well, I love that feedback. And again, if you're an aspiring head of people, that's a blueprint for you right there. So take that to heart. We've gone almost 40 minutes without touching on AI, which is, probably should be a record at this day and age. But I do want to get your perspective. Like, obviously, you kind of came up through the field through, places like McKinsey and GE that had a very, well kind of structured, data-driven approach. Obviously, Google perfected that, out of kind of core HR now, but still very much influencing it. What is your take on the next? I won't even kind of put a long horizon out there because nobody knows what's going to happen in 3 years, but even like the next year, right? As you followed how generative AI has, kind of rolling out, how things like, new platforms like Perplexity are kind of reshape how we think about AI-driven search to, this next phase of agentic AI, which, we're kind of in the early stages now and be able to do like multi-stage actions. I think we're entering an era where there's going to be a lot of pressure on companies and certainly HR teams to do more with less. Efficiency is going to be a big driver. Companies are going to invest in AI in different ways. Lawyers are going to have a great time because I think some of them are going to invest in it in wrong ways. But I would love to just get your take generally. Like, what is your view on how, this next, we'll just say 12 to 18 months are going to be reshaped as the adoption of AI continues?
Well, at the highest level, a few things are true. One is Upwork just did a study and they found that 71% of people, this was a survey of 2,500 people, execs and frontline, 71% of people who are using AI today in corporations feel that it makes their jobs harder, not easier. So right now, there's a lot of experimentation and testing, and on average, it's making things worse. So point 1. Point 2 is what the data suggests is AI is really good at making kind of below average, but it actually degrades performance on highly complicated tests, processes and tasks. And the reason is people find they respond to AI as this fits more authoritative than it is. So the hallucination problem. So what that means for HR leaders is it's amazing for first drafts and populating things, right? Performance review, assessments, things like that, job descriptions and things like that. it absolutely needs human oversight, like human in the loop, as they call it, to review, edit, fine tune, and things like that. I think the third thing is there are a lot of jobs that AI, well, today, the third thing is today, AI is sort of impacting what I call the fingers and toes of jobs, right? It's like a little bit of a job here, a little bit of a job there. There aren't whole jobs like financial analysts that AI is completely replacing. But I know for a fact, there's large companies like major consulting firms, major investment banks that are asking outside companies to take all their customer data and make what's called a synthetic of it. So a fake version of the data, same statistical properties, completely anonymized, so that all that data can get shared inside companies and then run reports on it using AI. And the point of that is that kind of system allows you to not need new hires, new entry-level associates. And part of the reason you're seeing a pullback in CS and data science hiring and entry-level hiring in general, I mean, yeah, there's economic uncertainty and all these things, but the bigger issue is companies are really experimenting with things that will make it unnecessary to hire new grads for lots and lots of jobs. And you're seeing that already really clearly in customer support, but in data science, early signs in like legal assistant, legal analysis, paralegal roles, investment banking associate roles, things like that. And so from an HR perspective, the problem that eventually creates is if indeed AI becomes really useful at sort of largely replacing a lot of these entry-level jobs, which will happen over the next 3 to 5 years, that means 5 years after that, we're not going to have people who are going to grow into managers. So we're going to have a shortage of line managers. So there's a lot of work to be done in finding where humans can keep adding value, as a lot of the things that we used to do, synthesizing, summarizing, analyzing, get more effectively done by machines. And that's a huge challenge for HR. Ethan Mollick, who's a professor at Wharton, actually argues that the HR function should be in charge of AI at companies because it doesn't behave in a predictable way like normal software. You don't pay for it like normal software. And the ultimate impact is on human beings.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, if you're new to this space and you haven't read this, Ethan's book, Co-Intelligence, is an absolute must read. And so there's a lot you're going to take away from this episode, but let that be one thing if that book is not on your radar, because I think you have to have that fundamental understanding of what these technologies are, what they're not, what they're capable of, what they're not. But he has a point he made in the book several times over that no matter when you're reading this book, you are working and interfacing with the least capable AI model that you will ever interface with. Right. And to kind of illustrate just the point of how fast these systems and these LLMs are advancing. Laszlo, I want to kind of wrap up with a bit of a lightning round. So sure. There are some listeners that had some questions for you, and I want to jump right into a few of those. We'll keep these answers pretty tight, but I want to see if we can hit a couple of these before we wrap up. The first one comes from Leela Srinivasan, and her question and comment is, you've pioneered on both the HR practitioner side and the HR tech vendor side. So what's one thing you think HR tech vendors misunderstand about being in the practitioner seat? And what's one thing that you think more HR practitioners could keep in mind when buying HR technology? So
for the HR tech vendors, money is the signal of purchase intent. Companies will have lots of meetings with you, but it's typically because they're exploring. So if they're not writing a check, they're actually not that into you. And on the buyer side, you have to understand this about the vendors, that like, it's fine to have lots of meetings with them. They'll spend lots of time, but like put them out of their mercy, or put them out of their suffering their misery if you're not actually going to buy. And it's okay to tell them we're going to buy later, what have you. On the implementation side, just realize it's always going to be, it's like every technology. It's going to take 30% longer, be 20% harder, and it'll deliver 80% of what's promised. But if that is what you want, and that's usually better than status quo, it's still worth trying.
Yeah. All right. I love that. I'm going to jump ahead to the next question from Ryan Batty. And Ryan asks, in 2014, he read an interview that you did with the Washington Post where you talked about the concept of emergent leadership. Your definition of the concept and its importance resonated with him and is something that he references often with his teams that he leads and works with. How important is emergent leadership today, 10 years later, in the current state of work, and why?
So I think emergent leadership is underutilized, but more important than ever. At least the way we define it at Google and at Humu, the key element of emergent leadership is not just that you emerge as a leader, but that you're also willing to relinquish power and let somebody else lead, that it's situational and opportunistic. But if you can instill that sort of, lack of ego in teams where they're instead united by a bigger purpose and people step up and step back as needed, you're going to have a completely different team experience, and it's going to be amazing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I interviewed, actually on the podcast a few episodes ago, the former head of training for SEAL Team 6. And he had a similar model, a different title for it, but it's this notion that, he was like, I led 14, over 14 kind of tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. I was the leader of all those missions, but I was rarely actually in that lead role. You have to be, as a leader, be able to step back and have other people whose experiences, strengths, capabilities better match that situation, step up. So it's an egoless leadership. And yeah, I think that model from the SEALs to business absolutely is the way to go. I want to get one more question, and this one comes from Jeff Baumgarten. And he asks, he'd love to hear your views on interviewing these days. His perspective on the subject published years ago your perspective has been very formative for him. Curious to see if your views on interviewing have shifted at all over the last decade.
Not only have they not shifted, but all the data that keeps coming out reinforces them, that you should use structured behavioral interviews, that you should have a panel or a committee assess candidates rather than the hiring managers. That you don't need that many interviews if you're structuring them correctly. And then the only thing that I actually didn't write much about, but that is really, really important, that's often forgotten, is every interview is a sales opportunity as well to kind of build a relationship with that person. And in particular, for people who you decline, it's so important to, reach out to them, make them feel as good as possible, and have a human actually engaged in that, because that often gets forgotten. But the basics, there's 80 years of science on this, going back to Daniel Kahneman in the 1950s, doing selection for the Israeli military. The science is pretty clear. And you end up, it turns out, what I have seen since, over the last decade and a half is one of the ways you keep your company performance from degrading over time is you need to hire better than average people. And if you have an average hiring process, you're going to get average results. And that's why every company, the people are kind of the same. Everyone says our people are better, but then you move around and they're all kind of the same. You have to have a different hiring process to generate a different outcome. And the science is still robust.
Yeah. Did you have a publication, something that you've kind of released around what that optimal hiring process is for hiring above average talent? Because, selfishly, I would love to read it. But also, I think for listeners, if there's a way for them to kind of go deeper on that perspective, that would really be helpful. Because you're right. I think a lot of interview processes tend to be pretty generic, pretty vanilla, and it leads to those results.
Nothing since the book Work Rules.
Okay.
See in the background. So I think chapters 4 and 5 were all about how to do that. But I will say, eventually what I wrote on LinkedIn was from the candidate perspective. So as a candidate, what's really interesting is because most companies run average biased hiring processes, as a candidate, you can exploit that. And so both on your resume and how you answer interview questions, there's a way to do that increases your odds of getting a job, because you're sort of fighting against an average system that doesn't work very well. So that kind of stuff I put on LinkedIn. It's in my pinned posts, but the short version is for the resume, all your bullets should describe what you accomplish as. I accomplished X by doing Y as measured by Z. And then in interviewing, you should basically practice your answers ahead of time. And there's a structure for how you should do that. But there's a way to game the system, given that most hiring companies don't do their job well.
Yeah. Well, and I think also just to, kind of reinforce your point on the resume, the biggest mistake I see people making is writing the resume like a job description, just responsibilities, right? So I have no idea, did you do this effectively? What was the outcome of the business? What? And so it's I was responsible for blah, blah, blah. Well, great. How effective were you in doing that? What did it mean for the business? So, Laszlo, you dropped some real, go ahead, please.
I was just gonna say, well, and you're one of the best talent acquisition people on the planet. So, I mean, your wisdom about how not to do that is incredibly valuable to whoever's watching or listening, because you've seen more of these than almost anybody. So anybody listening or watching should, if their resume looks like what you're describing, they should change it.
Yeah, well, that is generous and kind and appreciated. And likewise, I think it's been great to learn more about not just kind of your career path, but your upbringing and how it led to that, the entrepreneurial roots of your family. And I just appreciate your voice. I think that you've been leading from the front in this space for a very long time. And I think that the evolution of a lot of what we do in this field can be traced back to a lot of the work that you did at Google and beyond. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for leading from the front. And I appreciate you making time to share your deep wisdom with all of us.
You're very welcome, and thank you for having me. And thanks to everyone who watches and listens and the good work they're doing every single day. It's a hard job, but it makes a really big difference for people.
All right. Thanks so much, Laszlo.
Thank you.